Olá, começa aqui o BdF Entrevista Internacional. O nosso convidado dessa vez é Vijay Prashad. Lembrando que essa entrevista está sendo conduzida no dia 11 de dezembro e vai ser gravada em inglês. Hi Vijay, it's a pleasure to have you. Historiador, escritor, jornalista, comentarista político, editor da Leftward Books, correspondente-chefe da Globetrotter e membro sênior da Universidade Chinesa de Renmin. Vijay Prashad é considerado um dos principais intelectuais marxistas da atualidade. And I would like to cover with you some of the most important events of the year in the international news. I'd like to start with Venezuela. We had elections that were contested by the opposition and some foreign countries, United States and Europe, the European Union included. And we're talking about a country that is suffering a lot of sanctions from the United States. I'd like to have your opinion on this Venezuelan elections for the start.
I mean, the first thing I would say is that, countries that are in a situation of near war or war, it's very difficult for them to hold an election. The immense sanctions campaign on Venezuela is effectively a war. And I think it would have been appropriate for the government to have held back on the election, frankly. There's enough, experience around the world to say when there is a situation like this, very difficult to hold an election. The state apparatus, was not working at full capacity. People are suffering and struggling. So many people had migrated out of the country. I mean, the sheer fact that millions of people have migrated out of Venezuela calls into question the ability of the Venezuelans to hold an election. I mean, so many of their embassies are understaffed and so on. Nonetheless, Venezuela went ahead with the election. Part of the reason for the election was the Barbados Agreement that the Venezuelan government had made with the opposition, brokered by the United States. You see, the US is desperate to get Venezuelan oil into Europe. Because of the sanctions on Russia, Europe is struggling to find energy. And in fact, during 2022, the United States permitted France and Italy to buy petroleum from Venezuela. There was a real hope that if the Barbados Agreement held, then Venezuelan oil could enter Europe. Well, the election was again contested. It's always contested. The opposition has contested the election from the beginning of the Chavez era. That was to be expected. But then the reaction of different countries was a little surprising. The Europeans are desperate for Venezuelan oil. Why would they then contest the election? Particularly because they kept trying to violate Venezuelan sovereignty by rewriting its own laws, saying that, where are the papers? Show us the papers and so on. There's no obligation in Venezuela for anything to be published. In fact, the opposition candidate has to go to the government agency, the Central Election Council, and ask for a challenge. They never did, because the opposition candidate ran off to Spain very shortly thereafter. Obviously the countries in the region, Mexico and so on, tried to enter and mediate, but there was no space really for them to do anything. And because they also absorbed this strange American idea, release the facts, release the papers, which is not constitutional. It's as if, I would go and say that in the last Brazilian election, there was a fraud. Why? Because the procedures followed weren't procedures I want to see. Forget Brazilian law. It was curious that this happened. In the end, Mr. Maduro will be sworn into a new term in January. That's going to happen. That's a fait accompli. But nonetheless, the sanctions on Venezuela might tighten under Trump administration. Already the situation in Cuba is very difficult. So election happened, terrible reaction by the Europeans and some Latin American countries, but Mr. Maduro is going to have another term.
And how did you see the Brazilian position that exercised the veto power on the Brics meeting that prevented Venezuela to enter the bloc?
It's difficult to understand Brazilian foreign policy sometimes, to be honest with you. I understand that the Brazilian foreign ministry is pretty independent and has, a very long history of its belief in its capability and capacity and so on. And I'm told that Mr. Lula doesn't necessarily drive the foreign policy of the country on all issues, that there are various interests at play. I was a little surprised when Venezuela's entry into BRICS was blocked by Brazil. It's obvious that Venezuela is one of the larger potential economies in Latin America. Mexico certainly is not going to join the BRICS because it's already entangled in free trade agreements in North America with the United States and Canada. Venezuela is an obvious candidate for BRICS membership. And it's puzzling. It's almost as if the Brazilians didn't want another Latin American country in the BRICS bloc. But to be honest with you, I don't get it. I mean, what would have been better for Brazil than to have had Venezuela within the BRICS and then other BRICS countries having an influence on Venezuela? It would have been perfectly valuable. So with Venezuela's potential oil reserves within BRICS, BRICS basically has OPEC plus within it, with the inclusion of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so on. The addition of Venezuela would have been enormous, an enormous way to consider currencies, new financial systems, and so on. So really, Brazil lost an opportunity in its veto of Venezuela to enter the BRICS.
And how serious do you think that we should take the idea of giving up the dollar and using other currencies in transactions within the BRIC countries?
See, I'm not very much in the belief that de-dollarization is easy. I think it's very difficult. It's difficult for the following reason. In order for a currency, a major currency, to become a global currency for reserves, to be the currency of cross-border trade and so on, the country whose currency is used is going to have to give up controlling its capital. In other words, there can be no capital controls. You'll have to allow your land to be bought and sold in the international market and so on. The United States, in that sense, does a service to the world by allowing its assets to be traded in international markets. The Chinese will never allow the renminbi yuan to be openly traded. They will continue to use capital controls. They control their financial systems very tightly and so on. No other currency really at this time has the capacity to be like the dollar. Now, on the other hand, a lot of bilateral trade and multilateral trade is already taking place without using the dollar. Countries are using either their own currencies or a third currency to trade with each other. There's some problems with this because all trades don't reconcile easily. If Brazil has an uneven trade with Bolivia, what does Brazil do with the unused Bolivian peso? What is it going to do unless it can buy things using the Bolivian currency from, say, Argentina or Chile or somebody else? So unless you can completely reconcile trading systems, even bilateral trade has limitations. Some countries till now will only take the dollar, the euro, and so on. So we're not going to see de-dollarization or the emergence of a BRICS currency very quickly. We're moving in the direction of much more local currency trade. But I'm not one, to ring the bell and say de-dollarization is happening now. It's going to be a very long process, and I'm not sure what it would look like.
And what about the threats of Donald Trump? Threats towards anyone who decided to stop using the dollar for transactions. And by the way, how did you see his election this year in the United States?
Well, first, let's just deal with Mr. Trump and the dollar. Mr. Trump has made a lot of remarks in the recent period. Tariff is one of his favorite words. He's going to sanction countries that refuse to use the dollar and so on. I don't know how many of these threats are real. 100% sanctions on some countries, that's just going to hurt the United States. Even as Claudia Sheinbaum, president of Mexico, wrote in a letter to Trump. I mean, the sanctions on Mexico is crazy because so many American cars are just assembled in Mexico across the border from the United States. So you have all these American cars made in Mexico crossing the border, 100% sanctioned. People in the US won't be able to afford cars anymore. So there's a lot of empty threats mixed up in his statements. You know, the United States already effectively sanctions most of the countries that are beginning to do trade outside the dollar. China and Russia, for instance, their bilateral trade largely outside the dollar. India is trading with Russia in rubles and in rupees. India trades with Iran in rupees and so on. What is the US going to do? Sanction India? I mean, that's one of the few remaining developing countries that doesn't have US sanctions. I mean, by now, 70% of developing countries around the world have US sanctions. What are they going to do? Sanction 100% of them? That'll isolate the United States. So, I mean, I think we have to take some of these threats by Mr. Trump with a little less seriousness. I mean, I think all the things he said, they just cannot take place. You know, nobody's going to allow it to happen. Now, his own election was not entirely a surprise. The Democratic Party was going to be punished by its base for the support and more than support for participating in the genocide against the Palestinians. There was no way that the Democrats were going to be able to win back people who were deeply disappointed and angry by their participation in a genocide. At the same time, large sections of the working class who have been damaged by the effects of capitalism have been going here and there, searching for a political home. And for now, many of them have been voting for Mr. Trump, with the belief that his America First rhetoric is going to protect them. This is similar to the kind of base that Mr. Bolsonaro was able to create in Brazil. The working class in Brazil, damaged by capitalism, looking for a political home, not trusting in social democrats, unable to believe that the old political forces will help them, rushing to find somebody, something. And here come these avatars, these magical figures who promise everything. They say, we will make Brazil great again. We will make India great again. We will make America great again. And people, believed that maybe this is possible. The other was not happening. So it was not a surprise that Mr. Trump won. I mean, the Democratic Party was so disorganized that their candidate only came on the ballot months before the election. She never had a chance. I mean, she was put up there effectively to lose.
Talking about organization, do you believe that the new Republican administration of Donald Trump will be more organized than the previous one? And is it something to fear, that we should be fear of? And what about Elon Musk in the American government? What to expect about that?
I mean, firstly, one has to be very clear that there is the government in the United States, and then there's the state apparatus. The state apparatus, which includes a permanent military apparatus, never changes. Doesn't matter what government comes to power, the chief of staffs are going to be the same people. These apparatuses or apparati remain intact. There's no change. You have to remember that there are very deep roots in the US state. Particularly when it comes to foreign policy. They have certain commitments that are not very easy to shake. Now, Mr. Trump is indeed a peculiar figure because he comes in and shakes things up. He tried it in his first term. It will be interesting to see how it goes with Mr. Trump when he tries to end the war in Ukraine. There are large arms companies in the United States that are making so much money off the war in Ukraine. Will the arms industry permit Mr. Trump to stop that war? Because that means they lose a lot of profit. I don't know. We will see. At the same time, Mr. Trump has appointed Elon Musk, a great enemy of Brazil, and Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran against him, to a post where they're supposed to cut government funding. Now, the issue is, in the United States, the US government has been shrunk when it comes to things like social welfare. Very difficult to find social welfare disbursements or payments to cut. So the biggest area where Mr. Musk and Ramaswamy will have to look is in the military. So once again, the United States government is going to have a direct confrontation with the military and with the arms industry. First to try to end the war in Ukraine, then to cut the US state down. So that'll be interesting. What will they do? His appointment, Mr. Kennedy, to Health and Human Services, has committed himself to fighting against what is known as big food, the massive food industry. Now, if Mr. Kennedy actually goes after the food industry in the United States, saying that this food is not healthy, children shouldn't be eating it, and so on, his agenda would make the MST in Brazil happy, because precisely what the MST says, agroecological food, less chemicals, and so on. Well, it would be very interesting if Mr. Kennedy is able to have a direct confrontation with big food, because if Kennedy has a confrontation with big food in the United States, this will have an impact around the world, because the US food companies dominate so much of the processed food that gets sold around the world in different supermarkets, mercados, and so on. That'll be interesting. So I'm, in a sense, saying to you that there are going to be a lot of contradictions in the period ahead. And I don't think we should enter this period only looking at some of the dangers, because there are dangers. For instance, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is committed himself to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. He's committed himself to end the Bolivarian revolutionary process. He wants to put a number of radicals, activists, people that are well known in Brazil in prison. That's what Marco Rubio committed to. He's a dangerous man. I don't know how far he'll be able to move his own agenda. So there will be all kinds of things happening. A war against big food and a war against the left. And we shall see how these things turn out. But I must say, I think we should underestimate the danger of the Trump administration in general.
Okay, we're gonna make a little break and we're gonna be back soon. A gente faz um pequeno intervalo e volta já já. Estamos de volta com o BdF Entrevista Internacional. O convidado dessa semana é Vijay Prashad. Vijay, I would like to have your views on Palestine. This year we had witnessed the genocide that is taking place in the Gaza Strip. What do you think is going to happen next year? There are all sorts of different views, all sorts of different fears, including that the Palestinians could be deported to make space for more settlers from Israel in that place. What do you think is going to happen? Why do you think it happened now in 2024, the way it happened, and what do you believe it's going to happen in 2025?
Well, look, it started in 2023 with the initially pounding of Gaza, when the United States fully backed the Israelis, armed them, provided logistical support, diplomatic support. Mr. Netanyahu took advantage of the situation to effectively take care of all of his enemies around Israel. That's when the Israelis began their invasion of Lebanon, assassinated Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and then began to bomb and weaken the Syrian Arab army around Damascus and all the way up the highway M5 to Hama and Homs. Israel provided basically the air support for the rebel groups to leave Idlib, the Islamist rebel groups to leave Idlib and overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And then Israel entered by tank to take the buffer zone set up by the United Nations in 1974 and has effectively taken control of a large part of Syria, the other side of the Syria-Israel armistice line. So within the course of 2024, what the Israelis have done is scored an enormous victory. First, they've effectively damaged Hamas. It's going to be very difficult for Hamas to rebuild in Gaza. Secondly, they've deeply damaged Hezbollah in Lebanon, pounding Beirut, killing the leadership, destroying a lot of the places where the Hezbollah fighters had been keeping their stores of rockets and so on, and then forcing a ceasefire on Hezbollah to move away from the armistice line between Lebanon and Israel. And then having weakened Hezbollah, the Israelis were able to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, which was providing a land bridge from Iran through Iraq to get material from Iran to Hezbollah. So in the space of some months, Israel has been able to weaken all its main enemies, the Syrian government, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and in the process has weakened Iran's ability to act in the region. The only force that is still troubling Israel is the Ansar Allah government in Yemen, which is continuing to fire rockets, has taken out the port of Eilat, which is there on the Red Sea, and so on. But otherwise, Israel has scored an enormous victory. Now, what's going to happen in 2025 is in a way worse for the Palestinians, because Donald Trump is going to permit this Israeli government of Mr. Netanyahu to finally move their capital to Jerusalem. I believe that Mr. Netanyahu is going to try and start clearing out at least northern Gaza and bringing settlers back in there, and then squeezing the Palestinians in a way towards the Egyptian border. It is going to be a very ugly situation. It's very important for people around the world to be vigilant, to continue their opposition to the genocide that is happening, to the crimes against humanity that are being committed. This overthrow of the government of Bashar al-Assad is decisively because of the Israeli bombardments of the Syrian Arab army. There is no other explanation for how quickly the Hayat was able to come from Idlib to Damascus. Yes, Turkey provided weapons, provided military force, and so on. But this is not something that Turkey could have done alone. It required the sustained bombing by Israel of the Syrian army and Syrian government facilities that deeply damaged and weakened the Syrian state. So this is an enormous victory for Israel, and that's why we have to be very careful not to stop our sustained campaigning against the genocide.
And how do you see the Palestinian resistance within Israeli borders, in the Palestinian territories? Do you think there's some chance for them to keep resisting, or Israel's job was too well done? They destroyed the Palestinian resistance.
You know, it's hard to say, because I think right now there's a kind of muffle on the Palestinian resistance. Weapons are not getting in. I fear that the Gulf Arab states that had provided financing are not providing the financing at this time. I think many of the groups are quite demoralized by the state of their command and control and leadership. You know, in the West Bank, Israel has effectively arrested the entire leadership of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Khalida Jarrar, for instance, major leader, has been sitting in and out of jail inside Israel. She was a major leader of the PFLP in the West Bank. While they've been arresting all the leaders of the left organizations in the West Bank, they've been decimating the Hamas leadership in Gaza, one after the other, killing them. I mean, the killing of Mr. Yahya Sinwar was, of course, the most dramatic, but we don't see the next level leadership. They are also being killed off one by one. So it's going to be hard for Hamas, for Islamic Jihad to regroup. I don't know what's going to happen in Syria. You know, the Israelis trust this HTS group, the Hayat, that have come from Idlib. former Al-Qaeda fighters. The Israelis trust them. Seems they made a deal with them. But I don't know what's going to happen. Will this Al-Qaeda group turn against Israel? After all, the leader has the name Al-Jolani, meaning he comes from the Golan Heights. Is he going to fight to recover the Golan Heights? I don't know. This is not clear. But for now, I think the resistance is, of course, fighting, but from a position of great weakness.
And what about Iran? The avenue between Iran and Lebanon is now closed. They cannot provide arms, money, or oil money for Hezbollah. Do you think they're going to find another way to reach Hezbollah, or do you think there isn't any chance of regime change in Tehran, or how do you see it?
First, I think the Iranians are being very cautious, and I don't blame them. They don't want to welcome a US barrage of missiles and bombs. They don't want Tehran to be devastated. I mean, they have their own national interests at stake. The United States is a dangerous power. It destroyed Iraq. It destroyed Libya. It is very capable of just coming in and destroying Iran. So the Iranians are being, I think, quite sensible in not trying to do something right now when allies are in a position of weakness. I think they are being quite intelligent. Hold your fire. Wait to see what happens. It is going to be almost impossible for Iran to resupply Hezbollah by conventional means. The United States has currently blockaded the Eastern Mediterranean with its ships. Any ship going to Lebanon is got to have a good reason to go there. And no Iranian carrier is going to be permitted to come near the Lebanese shoreline. So the waters are closed off to Iranian resupplying of Hezbollah. The land bridge, as you said, is gone. The Turks are not going to permit Turkey to be used as a land bridge because, after all, the Iranians could send goods through northern Iraq, which is a close ally of the United States. The Kurdish government in the north of Iraq, ally of the United States, has close relations with Israel. They are not going to permit any convoy of Iranian weapons going to Hezbollah. If the Iranians send something to Yemen, how do the Yemenis get it to Lebanon? Very complicated. They cannot. Saudi Arabia will not allow it. Jordan will not. Yeah, I mean, Iran has no possible way of supplying Hezbollah that's easy to understand. Everything is shut off. That doesn't mean Hezbollah will not be able to recover from within Lebanese society. It has an enormous good feeling within Lebanese society, but you can't manufacture missiles and so on so easily, weakened. And that's part of the tragedy of Israel's victory. It has effectively, been able to weaken all of Palestine's allies. So for the period ahead, it's not going to be easy going for the Palestinians.
And what about Syria? Do you believe it's going to become a failed state like many others, Libya, Iraq? Or do you believe it's possible for them to reach some sort of confederation that could accommodate the different ethnic groups, the different political interests within the country?
Well, first, it's important to realize that Syria doesn't control its own territory. The United States controls large parts of eastern Syria, including most of the oil fields that are Syrian. Israel now controls large sections of the south and southwest of Syria, including, of course, the Golan Heights, which they had seized in 1973. And Turkey controls a large part of what used to be northern Syria that's held by the Turks. Independent Kurdish groups control the section between where Turkey is and where the United States is. These groups against the new government in Damascus. Let's see if they can come to an accommodation. On the coastline in the northwest, that's where the large Alawite community is from. The Alawite community is hated by this government in Damascus. I don't know if they're going to tolerate the Alawites, the Armenians, the other Christians, the Kurds, and so on, and the large Shia population which is adjacent to Damascus. I don't know. I don't know what this government after a few days is going to be able to do. It's clear that the leader of this government, Mr. Jolani, had previously been openly sectarian, had led pogroms against, Shiites, Alawites, and so on. In the middle, in these last few years, somehow some American or Israeli consultancy firm has been with him and they've sort of polished him up. Because the interview he gave to CNN, he was virtually unrecognizable. He agreed that when he was young, he did terrible things. When he was young, he's still young. He means just a few years ago. Just a few years ago, when he was beheading people, he called those youthful indiscretions. What young people do. He says that now he is a serious person. He wants Syria for all Syrians. We have to wait and see. He is commanding a group of people, including from the Turkish-speaking populations of Central Asia, including Uyghurs from China and so on. These are hardcore Sunni sectarians. Will they be able to tolerate large minorities who are Shia, Alawite, Kurds, and so on? I have no idea. We're going to see. I don't believe that the rebranding of Mr. Al-Jolani is going to be sufficient. Underneath that is an old Al-Qaeda fellow. So we're going to have to see. I wish Syria the best. I hope that he is being sincere for the sake of the Syrian people. But I'm afraid that somebody with such a strong sectarian history, such a young man who just a few years ago was involved in beheading people, I don't know if this young man could have changed so quickly. But again, for the sake of humanity in Syria, I hope he's learned his lesson and is going to be peaceful towards the people there.
It's funny how strange the connections, the alliances that we saw this year. For example, this guy from Al-Qaeda is a friend of Israel now. We could never imagine something like that. The same way I could never imagine that in the beginning of the year, Netanyahu, that was suffering from very low popularity within Israel, would end the year in such a high. What a politician, isn't it? And what about these accusations within Israel that of corruption, of trying to sabotage the balance of powers in Israel? Do you think there is some future for these charges, or do you believe all these wars would change the mood of the country? And also the hostage situation, do you think it's going to be determinant for the future of Netanyahu?
This begs the question of where is the Israeli public in all of this? And, I'm sorry to say large parts of the Israeli public they may not like Mr. Netanyahu, but they like this war. They would like to see what they consider their threats taken care of. They have an illusion that if they keep bombing people, that there will be a final ending to the threat against Israel, that then they can just permanently occupy the Palestinians or push them out into other countries. This is where the Israeli population is politically. Israeli population is politically far to the right of the center. So Mr. Netanyahu, despite his own personal legal problems, despite his quite terrible attitude in general, despite all of that, actually reflects this large section of the Israeli public that wants this war. And I think that's the sad part of it. Is Mr. Netanyahu a good politician? Yes, of course. Was it his special political tricks that got him this, large majority? I don't think so. In fact, what gets him this large support is that Mr. Netanyahu started a war that the Israeli public liked. And I think that's a very unfortunate thing to say, because one would wish the Israeli public would be somewhere else. But it's not. It's actually very much for this war. And so Mr. Netanyahu's corruption seems petty in comparison to the greatness, as far as they are concerned, of this war.
A gente faz pequeno intervalo e volta já. A gente volta com o BdF Entrevista Internacional com o convidado Vijay Prashad. Vijay, talking about Russia now. The Ukraine war, another big war of the world today. Do you think we are near the end of this war or not? We're going to see another full year of this conflict in Europe?
You know, this particular war in Ukraine is going to rely a lot on what Mr. Trump does. If Mr. Trump decides to slow down on funding to the Ukrainian military in particular, so yeah, I mean, this entirely depends on what Mr. Trump is able to do. If Mr. Trump is serious about creating a ceasefire in Ukraine, I mean, he can do it easily once he's president. All he has to do is to slow down on US funding for the Ukrainian government and military. If he does that, that's going to force Mr. Zelensky to open negotiations with Putin again and start discussing the situation between these two neighbors. It might mean that Ukraine would have to recognize the Russian control of Crimea, maybe recognize that parts of the Donbass are part of Russia. You know, Russia might have to give some security guarantees and negotiation. But it all comes down to what the United States does. The Europeans are going to put no pressure on Ukraine to come up with a deal with the Russians. It really is all in the hands of Mr. Trump. So let's see what happens, you know, in the second week of, or the second half of January, when Mr. Trump is the president of the United States.
And what about Vladimir Putin? Do you think that he ends up the year of 2024 stronger or weaker than he started?
Well, it depends on what you're looking at to measure despite immense sanctions. His agreements with China and with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea has really helped him. I mean, it's enabled him to get material to fight his war. It's enabled his economy to keep going and so on. Mr. Putin has not been isolated by the global south. Countries continue to have relations with Russia. They buy and sell Russian oil and so on. So in that sense, Mr. Putin remains quite strong. In the eyes of Europe and the United States, of course, they see Putin as weakened. Now, he is no longer welcome in Western capitals. I don't think he worries about that. He has plenty of places in the world to go. And I think this is important for people to recognize. The world is also changing. You know, Europe and the United States dominate world affairs. People are not scared to take them on. The Russians have taken them on. Mr. Putin is coming out of this pretty strong. Now, obviously, there are areas where Russia is deeply weakened, but these are not fatal weaknesses. These are weaknesses that they will recover. They may not be able to get technology from the West. They're getting it from elsewhere. That's an interesting development. Cross-border trade between China and Russia has increased dramatically. That's an interesting development. We'll soon see Russia trading with Asian countries far more than it trades with any Western country. That makes Putin stronger? Probably.
One of the reasons people say that the far right grow in Europe is the fact that the Ukraine war is really pressuring financially the governments of Europe. So they created a crisis that created some space for the growth of the far right. Do you believe the far right in Europe reach its peak, or will there's more room for it to grow next year?
In this month, Tricontinental is going to release a text on populism, where we analyze the far right in North America and in Europe. I'm very interested in this development because we consider it a far right of a special type, because this far right uses electoral means, by and large, to gain political strength. So certainly, in several countries, the far right is going to continue to have quite a strong showing. Some of this has to do with the war in Ukraine. You know, whereas the centrist parties, the parties of capitalism, you know, the mainstream parties, are very much committed to this war in Ukraine, the far right has taken over some of the critiques of the left and has come out against NATO in some countries, come out against this war in Ukraine, and so on. Now, there are lots of far right of a special type parties like Alliance for Deutschland in Germany, which is both pro-NATO and against the war in Ukraine. But this against the war in Ukraine is the minimum that's gaining the far right some appeal. People don't want this war. It is hurting their paychecks. It is an economic drag on most European countries. So we shall see. If the war continues, the far right is going to make quite considerable gains.
We talked about a lot of gains from the right. It's very frustrating in a way. But I'd like to change the subject and talk about the uprisings in Africa, in the Sahel area. It's anti-colonial. They are basically anti-colonial. They are against against France and what it means. I'd like to see your views on the subject. Do you think it's some sort of it could be considered inspiring? It could be some sort of model for the future, or do you believe it's something else? It's just an isolated event in that part of the world?
Firstly, all across the French colonies, there's been unrest. It's not just in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, now a little bit in Chad and a little bit in Senegal, not just there. I mean, in New Caledonia, in the Pacific, there was a major protest movement led by the Kanaks this year against French, settlement in New Caledonia, which is in the Pacific Ocean. This French dégage is a strong movement. France, get out. People want France out of their political and military affairs. They don't want France to dominate them. So it's very clear. It's an anti-colonial struggle. It is very inspirational. Now, they are also being isolated and challenged, even from sections of the metropolitan left and liberals who say, well, it's a coup d'etat. It's not a people's revolution. This is a ridiculous argument. This is not merely a coup d'etat. It's a coup led by progressive officers. They want to create change. They want their countries not to have the wealth stolen and so on. So I think they're very important. Whether these will provide a way forward is hard to say, because they're, again, isolated. They're under attack. They have to confront the great Al-Qaeda threat in the north, in the Sahara area. It's not going to be easy for them to survive. So one has to pay very much close attention. And there was a conference held recently in Niamey, in Niger, organized by the International People's Assembly, Pan-Africanism Today, and other groupings in Niger, to give solidarity to this amazing new development taking place there. I don't want to exaggerate its implications, but I will say quite bluntly that it's the important front against colonialism in our world today.
And what about the environment? We saw so many meetings, COPs, and a lack of progress in dealing with the consequences of climate change. Are you optimistic about that, or how is your position about the environment today? And what to expect for next year?
Yeah, let's face it, the major polluting countries of the past and to some extent of the present, the Western countries, are doing nothing. They're not financing the climate budget. They're just doing nothing. We do see some major advances. I was just in China. 40% of the cars in Shanghai are electric cars. The Chinese are building new cities which are near carbon zero and so on. These are extraordinary developments. Solar panels everywhere. But China is not the world. The world is in a different place. There's a lot of environmental damage, leave alone climate change. Just environmental damage, continuing dumping of garbage into waters, the big plastic island at the top of the Pacific. All of that is terrible. At the same time, more and more people are being drawn into the climate and environmental movement. I think this is important. This is an important issue. We're going to have to struggle hard. The oil companies cannot be allowed to take over the conversation, as they did at the recent COP meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan. They cannot be allowed to take over the debate. We have to be there. So I would say it's a big struggle ahead. I'm not sure really where it's going to turn out.
What about the artificial intelligence? Do you believe that the world is dealing correctly with that, or is it something that we should be more careful about?
The first thing I would say, and to be more careful, is I don't use the term artificial intelligence for two reasons. One is it's not actually intelligence. It's machine learning. That's a better term for it. It's machine learning. The machine has to be taught things, and then it's able to replicate what it has learned from humans. It's not that somehow, and I think this creates its own illusions, that somehow by itself, artificially, this machine is intelligent. It's able to make decisions. No, it can only do what you tell it to do. So far, that's the machines we've made. These are very important machines. I mean, right now, I was in China, as I said, there are so many dark factories where there are no workers. It's all robotics. It's all machine-learned robots that are doing repetitive tasks. Is this a good thing? Yes, it's a good thing, because we don't want to have, human labor used in the same way forever. Is it a bad thing? Yes, it's a bad thing. Lots of humans are losing jobs right now. How do we transition the economy from, partly machine intensive, but also labor, to all machine intensive, no labor? These are all big issues to deal with sociologically, ethically, and so on. But we already have highly sophisticated machine learning systems, driverless cars and so on. Very, very clever machine learned systems. It's all over the place. I don't have a problem with it, frankly, because I would like to live in a world where, where the most difficult jobs, cleaning sewers and so on, are done by machine learned robots, and humans can do other things with their lives. They can have time to discuss politics, ethics, and so on. Right now, people are working so hard for so little that they find it very hard to be citizens of their country. I would like all that to change. Now, of course, I don't want to enter a stage where machines take over and we become their slaves. But let's hope we don't get to that stage, because when you get to that stage, then we can discuss artificial intelligence.
Indeed. Just to finish, I would like to know if you could give us some reasons to be optimistic next year, some good signs that the world is presenting to us.
Look, frankly speaking, and Rodrigo, this is my own peculiarity, I get the best hope reading novels and poems. I would just recommend, go to the public library, go to the fiction section, go to the poetry section, take out a book, read about people's emotional landscape and lives. It helps you relax and be a better person. To read another book about war or about environmental catastrophe can become, a burden on your head. And I'm guessing that the people who watch Brasil de Fato are people who are already quite, because Brasil de Fato does such good reporting, they're already quite aware of current events. I would say, friends, go and read a novel. I'm reading the latest novel from Murakami. He's a Japanese writer, splendid novelist. That's what I'm doing, just to get my head in order. If I spend all day following what's happening in some catastrophic war or some catastrophic climate disaster, I would drive myself crazy. People like us, we need to read more poems.
Absolutely. Do you have any favorite Murakami book? I love him.
Well, this new one is pretty good, but my favorite Murakami book is Dansu, Dansu, Dansu. Also published in English as Dance, Dance, Dance. Love that book. I love all his books, but that's a particular favorite of mine. Any Murakami book that people can get their hands on, please read it. And, the last time I was talking to somebody in Brazil, Rodrigo, it was Breno Altman. And Breno asked me, what's your favorite film? And I said, not film, director. My favorite film director is Ozu Yasujiro, who made Tokyo Story and all these earlier 1950s era brilliant films. So yeah, Murakami and Ozu, enjoy.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Vijay, for everything. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. E o Brasil de Fato Entrevista fica por aqui. Eu agradeço por ter ficado com a gente o ano inteiro e a gente volta em fevereiro, às 9 da noite, na TVT e também nas plataformas do YouTube, tanto do Brasil de Fato como da TVT. Fica disponível também nas plataformas de áudio, como Spotify. Um abraço e tchau, tchau.